We are in Colossians chapter 1. I guess maybe in some way I should say you are in Colossians chapter 1 about verse 20. I wasn't here for the start or the second lesson of this series into Colossians chapter 1, but that's where we'll begin here in just a moment. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 20. I was joking with Larry starting before services. I was telling him that this building that these folks bought out in Bellsville where I held this meeting last week, it's an old building built like in 1890. There's not a single pew that's identical because they were all hand-built in a fanned approach. Just a neat old building, but had no air conditioning yet. And so they're working on that, so don't be afraid to go out there. In the next few weeks, they'll have essential air put in, and they're working on that problem. But I preached all week then without a suit coat because of that. And I was joking with Larry. I told him, I said, I kind of enjoyed that, actually. And I said, I might, and teasing, I said, I might just do that. And he said, well, that'd be all right. And I thought, well, that'd be all right, too. But I went in to get my jacket out of the office and realized I brought the wrong jacket. So I don't know which looks worse, the wrong jacket looking silly with the pants I've got on, or to not wear a jacket at all. So I'm going jacketless. That was my choice in the means. So I haven't gone completely casual on you. Anyway, so Colossians chapter 1. I appreciate Bill Reed. He's actually preaching out at Elk Fork today. And I appreciate him covering for me last Sunday morning, and Gary covering on Wednesday night in this study of the book of Colossians. And as Gary mentioned in his prayer, and I'm sure they both talked about as you begin the study of Colossians, is that it really is about Jesus and His preeminence. The letter really is Paul trying to encourage them, you don't need anything else. And when you get into chapter 2 in specific, you'll really start seeing several things mentioned. He says you don't need this, and you don't need that, and you don't need this, and you don't need that. You need Jesus. And all authority and preeminence belongs to Him. Jesus so much has said that, right? In Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20, roughly, He said how much authority had been given to Him in heaven and on earth. All of it, right? All authority had been given unto the Son. And so the headship of the body, the church, the preeminence of Jesus, the superiority of His covenant, those are the kinds of sentiments that we'll see and express throughout our study of the book of Colossians. And as we stated, I was told we got down to about verse 20 of Colossians chapter 1. And so let's pick up in the study of this book in that spot. And notice that he said, and having made peace through the blood of His cross, by Him to reconcile all things to Himself. By Him I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. It's interesting that one of the most violent acts of mankind, that from start to finish, the process by which that ultimately led Jesus to the cross and the scourging and the mockery and the shame, one of the saddest pictures that you could ever conjure in your mind of what they did to the Son of the living God. And yet He says that's the very action that brought peace to mankind. Through the violence and the hatred and the envyings and all of the challenges that bothered the Jews so much that they would take Jesus and hand Him over to the Romans. And the cowardice of a man like Pilate, who recognizes Jesus as innocent, who recognizes there's nothing worthy of death that is found in Him, and yet is willing to have Him crucified upon a cross and slain. And so it's amazing that such a horrible and violent moment in history actually brought the greatest act of reconciliation and peace that you can find. By the way, what's the word reconcile mean? Okay, to bring back together. When we use the word reconcile, generally there's one. What do we think of? What are you supposed to do every month? Supposed to. Checkbook, right? The accountant would tell me that, wouldn't he? But you're supposed to reconcile, right? You're checking, and you bring it into balance. You make sure that the numbers balance. When it comes to Jesus, He brings us back into balance with the Creator. Why were we out of balance with Him? Because of sin, generally speaking. Because of sin, we became out of harmony, out of direct connection to the Father. There was an imbalance. And nothing that we could do could change that, right? There was nothing within ourselves that we could accomplish that would have brought us back into balance with God. There was no act of service. There was no act of sacrifice that we could perform. There was nothing that was within our grasp or ability to be able to bring us back into balance with God. And so God sends His only begotten Son. He offers Jesus in order that we might be reconciled, brought back into balance with God. And not just us in some senses, but He reconciles what? All things to Himself. It's interesting. Go in your mind's eye for a minute back to creation. And when you go back to creation, you recall that all of the Godhead's involved in that, right? All of deity is involved in bringing about the creation of all things. And so because of man's choices, because of sin, because of various other aspects, there was this imbalance that happened with that which was created and our Creator. But through Jesus, all things can be reconciled again. All things can be brought back in harmony with Him. The things in earth or things in heaven, everything is able to be brought back to balance. And you that were sometime alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now hath He reconciled. That really pertains to everybody. In particular, it has some respect to Gentiles. Recall they were not really grafted into connection with God until Jesus. The Jews at least had a semblance of connection to the Creator up until the time of Jesus. But now all men are able. Even though sin created a situation where we were alienated from Him, we're allowed now to be reconciled again to Him. And in fact, He didn't say we're just alienated, but what were we as well? Enemies. That's a forceful statement, right? That sin just doesn't take us out of connection with God. It doesn't just create a scenario where I don't have the favor of Jehovah any longer. Sin actually creates a circumstance where now I'm considered the enemy of Jehovah. And I think if we would, that's interesting language, but I think if we would think of that soberly, maybe we would be less tempted to sin. Because I don't know about you, have you ever said of somebody, I wouldn't want them to be my enemy? Can you think of anything or anyone or any being that you would rather stay out of a circumstance where they consider me an enemy than Jehovah God? Could there be any more sobering thought to think about if I'm going to make some enemies? Certainly God would not be one of them that I would want to be opposed to. But that's what wicked works and the sinful behaviors had created. Not just an alienation, not just a disconnect from God, but a disconnect due in some senses to the fact that I have become His enemy because of those things. In the body of His flesh through death to present you holy and unblameable and unreprovable in His sight. Could we accomplish any of those things on our own? There was no way for us to be considered holy or unblameable or unreprovable. None of those things are possible separate and apart from Jesus. And yet all of those are necessary, right? All of them are crucial in being able to become reconciled unto our Creator. All of them are crucial in order to no longer be considered an enemy of Jehovah. All of them are necessary qualities and characteristics, and yet we were hopeless and helpless to create that scenario on our own. Jesus comes and dies to make that possible. We were in need of being holy in the eyes of God, but could not be such on our own. We were in need of having no blame or no charge put towards us, but impossible on our own. We were absolutely reprovable, but needed to become unreprovable in His sight. And Jesus is the equalizer, the reconciler, the one who brings all of that into balance and allows us to have that relationship with God despite all those difficulties and challenges. I'll pause for a second. And so then verse 23, if you continue in the faith. By the way, let me pause for a minute because I want you to think about this with me. And so here's been this description. You were enemies, you were alienated, you were unholy, you were in need of all these, and all of that sounds great because it sounds on the surface like Jesus has done what? All right, like there's nothing, it just happens. Right? It just happens. No obligation on my part, no accountability to that, no responsibility due to that. But though we could not have done any of that on our own, though we could not have accomplished any of those things within our own power and ability, but notice, he says, verse 23, if, and the word if is a conditional phrase, right? If's a condition. Here's the conditions by which I benefit from all those things that Jesus did. Here's the conditions by which that I'm allowed to access all the benefits that Jesus prescribes. If ye continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel. The challenge we have is to stay focused and consistent and committed to the faith that we have in Jesus because He's provided all of this benefit and blessing that you and I could not have had on our own. And be not moved away from the hope of the gospel. There's a lot of things that might distract us in this world, right? In my household, we call them squirrels because Deborah particularly is known for being in the midst of any kind of conversation. You could be talking about world peace, and if something distracting from some point anywhere comes, she immediately jumps to that subject. And the kids and I always say, well, here comes the squirrel, right? We're going to chase the squirrel. And then we'll come back to world peace. And that's what Satan does to us when it comes to our salvation in the gospel. He doesn't, and I've said this in various ways over the years, but Satan doesn't have to convince you to not think of the gospel ever. He doesn't have to convince you that it has no value. He doesn't have to get you to think that you should ignore all things that pertain to Jesus and the benefits that He extends. All he has to do is keep us distracted from it. If he can keep our focus on something else, if he can keep our attentions on some other issue, or some other thought, or some other thinking, then he can persuade and move and shape us away from that committed and convicted relationship that we need to have with God. We need to be grounded and settled, right? When you think of that permanency, and when you think of something that is grounded and settled, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which ye have heard, and which was preached to every creature, which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Now that's the setup statement, by the way, to some of the things he's going to say in chapter 2. Because what he's doing is he's beginning to set an argument that there are going to be all kinds of things that come along that try to persuade us or move us away from the gospel. And one of the challenges he sets before us is that in order to be able to overcome the entrapments and the persuasions and the philosophies and all the things that try to move us away from the gospel, in order to be prepared for that, we've got to get ourselves settled and grounded in the gospel itself. The things that Paul had preached and the message that had been declared to them. The very purposes that Paul had fulfilled as a minister. He's challenging them to recognize that these temptations to be moved away from the gospel are coming. And if they're not grounded and settled in that message, then they'll be easily persuaded away. And that takes conviction and faith on our part. I mean, think about it. The things that you're not... Have you ever been indecisive about anything? That's a silly question. All of us, right? All of us have been indecisive about things. Anybody that's tried to go to a restaurant with a group knows what indecisiveness is. But we can't be that way when it comes to our faith and convictions in Jesus. It needs to be a very determined and very convicted decision that I've made. I am settled in the gospel. And I know there's going to be every wind of doctrine. That's what he said in the book of Ephesians, right? And Ephesians and Colossians are kind of parallel letters. He said there's going to be winds of doctrine that come along. There's going to be things that want to toss God's children to and fro. And so get yourself planted and settled. So when those things come, you'll be prepared. And so who now rejoice, he says, in my sufferings for you, and fill up that which is behind of the afflictions of Christ in my flesh for his body's sake, which is the church. Recall we said that we're studying the 4 letters that were written from where? Prison, right? These are the 4 letters that Paul wrote from prison. We've studied Ephesians, we're talking about Colossians now, we'll eventually do Philippians, and we'll do Philemon as well before we're done. We're doing these 4. And so we talked in the letter to Ephesus, we talked about the fact that there might be a temptation of folks to say, do we really want to listen to a guy who's sitting in a jail? And do we really want to, is that really the source by which we want to have confidence and trust in when it comes to a message? And so he reminds them, yes, rejoice in I'm here because of preaching the gospel. I'm imprisoned because of my choices to honor Jesus. And so rejoice in my sufferings for you, and fill up that which is behind of the afflictions of Christ. The things that we endure and suffer and face because we're fighting for the cause of Jesus. And the things that Paul was enduring, whereof I am made a minister, according to the dispensation of God, which is given to me for you to fulfill the Word of God. I'm here for a purpose, Paul says. And he's trying to convince and help them recognize that this purpose of declaring the Word of God and making sure that they're anchored in that message so that they're not pulled away and distracted from it is happening. Even the mystery which hath been hid from ages and from generations, but now was made manifest to His saints. He reminds them that they live in a day of fulfillment. For a while under the Old Testament law, there were glimpses of what was to come. There were things that ultimately they would experience and see. Somebody eventually would. But he says, you live in a time where it's been fulfilled. Things have been made manifest that have been hidden for a long time. Mysteries that men had not seen revealed yet are now being understood by His saints. These things are important, he says. These are the things that you need to focus upon. These are the things that offer salvation. To whom God would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory, whom we preach, warning every man and teaching every man in all wisdom, that we may present every man perfect in Christ Jesus. Paul says our desire for all of this is to simply perfect the saints, to bring them into a situation where they can be then presented unto God and the great benefit and glory and the hope that is founded in Him. And we preach and we warn and we teach and we share all the wisdom of God in order that we might accomplish this level of perfection in Jesus that will allow us to be presented in that fashion. Whereunto I also labor, striving according to His working, which worketh in me mightily. In this last section of this letter, or this chapter, I should say, Paul simply reminds them of why it is that he's preaching and what the purpose of it is that he's trying to fulfill and the things that he's trying to accomplish that can only be accomplished through the Word. As he sets the stage for the rest of the letter, and as he's going to challenge them to stay steadfast in the simplicity and the purity of the gospel, even though there will be all kinds of other things that might try to distract them away from that.
We have the same hope they had.
Yeah. We're anchored in the very same thing. It hadn't changed. And we become established in the very same message, and we need to be just as convicted and have just as much confidence in the testimony of the gospel as others, because it establishes us as well. If you have those questions, I'll run through them real quick with you out of chapter 1. I apologize. I went to put it on the screen and I forgot I hadn't shared my Colossians folder with this computer yet, so I'll do that later. See it there. But if you have your questions, in question 1, how does Paul describe the audience to which he writes this letter? Saints? Faithful? Okay. Believers. Okay. This is a challenge. What is the root of the first of these words, and what does it imply? In other words, the writer of the question was challenging. Anybody even look that up? Find what the root of where all this comes from? Anybody grab a dictionary? And I should have warned you ahead. These were Jeff Smith written questions. Texas Jeff Smith, who Dr. Jeff Smith. And so he can dig sometimes deeper than maybe we're willing to. We'll come back to that then. If you get some time to look at that later. I'll give you another chance for that. By what means did the Colossians come to know of Christ and attain faith?
They heard the truth.
Okay, the truth of the gospel would come and it builds up the faith. By what means did they become the recipients of God's grace? In verses 3 through 8. Okay, obedient, right? By choosing to become followers. What three things does verse 9 say are necessary to have a walk worthy of the Lord? Okay. Okay, knowledge. Okay, and spiritual understanding that we can gain. And certainly Ephesians 3, 4, and 5 and chapter 5 also have similar thoughts in relationship to it. Is the apprehension of God's knowledge automatic and immediately complete for man? No, you work at it, right? And if not, how is it described in verse 10? Yeah, it's a growth process, right? It's a growth process that comes. Not just something that it's an immediate thing. It's something that happens over time with growth and effort on our part. What is outside the kingdom of Christ, and who holds dominion over those remaining there?
Darkness.
Okay. And who holds the... Okay, all right. He's influencing that. Continue. And what benefits are found inside the kingdom then? Yeah, redemption through His blood and the forgiveness of sins there at the end of verse 14. According to this passage and the rest of the Bible, was Christ from eternity, or is He a created being? He's eternal, right? He's deity, as is God the Father. Find other passages to support your answer. Did you? Okay, John chapter 1. Yeah, start Matthew 1 to Revelation. You can go through all of it, and you can see. Yeah. You can back up even to the beginning of all things. How many bodies and heads are there? There's one, right? There's one body and one head. And this passage talks of the making of peace. Between what two parties was peace attained through Christ, according to this passage? That's what we studied this morning. Yeah, us and God, right? Basically, and Jesus is the facilitator of that. According to verse 22, what is the goal or a goal of the Lord concerning His children? Yeah, to present us holy and unblameable and unreprovable. And finally, question 10, verse 28 is a most wonderful and yet often overlooked statement of purpose. What does Paul preach? Okay. How does Paul preach? Okay, through warning. And toward what goal does Paul preach? Yeah, to present, right? The goal is to be able to present man perfect. So Jesus is what they preach. Warning, folks, is the method he mentions here in this text, and the result he's looking for is that they may be able to present God's children perfect before the Father. Okay, jump into chapter 2. Again, I apologize if I moved quickly through that. When you weren't here for the first half of the chapter, it's hard for me to know exactly. You probably talked about some of those kinds of things already, and so that's why I just felt like we'd move through the rest of that chapter and jump to chapter 2 now. So Paul says, "Now, for I would that you knew what great conflict I have for you, and for them at Laodicea, and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh." And so Paul's concern is that he's writing these letters, and people are seeing what he's writing, but they may not have ever what? Yeah, been in his presence. that can change the dynamics of things, can't it? If you see written instructions, that's one thing. But if you're standing face to face with somebody, it can change the dynamics of it. Now what's interesting is that the Bible also shares with us that when Paul happened to actually get to places that he had written, what did they say about it? You may recall about his physical presence. Yeah, we expected a giant, right? You write. The things you write are big and bold and strong, and he'd show up and he didn't appear. You know, have you ever heard a voice from somebody, then you see him for the first time, you're like, that doesn't match up, right? Well, that's kind of the way Paul was in some ways. But I don't think that's really what he's addressing here. What I believe Paul's addressing is he knows it's hard to receive, especially with boldness, the kinds of things that he's sharing with them and the things that he's declaring to them. It might be difficult for them to want to adhere to it simply because Paul penned it. And if he could put a face to it, sometimes that can change the thought processes about the message itself. He's concerned that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love and unto all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the acknowledgement of the mystery of God and of the Father and of Christ. And I could be wrong here, but here's what I simply believe Paul's saying. Writing is a skill. And I pointed at Danny because that's what he's done most of his life. And communication through writing, to me, is probably the most challenging type of communication. And the reason is, if I'm speaking to you, you can see what? You can see my eyes, you can see my face, you can see my body language, you can visualize how I'm expressing something. And you can almost extract certain understandings and meanings about things in the manner in which that I express them. One of the odd things even about our live streaming is that we generally don't have a mic open to the audience when I'm speaking. In other words, the only thing folks at home generally hear is what comes through this microphone that's pinned to me. Now, I say that's interesting because sometimes I might say something and they don't hear you react to what so they don't know at times even at home, was he being serious? Did they know something about him that helped? So communication is hard. And Paul says, if I was present with you, you might understand these things better. But I'm doing the best I can to write them in such a way that you'll appreciate the mysteries that are found in Jesus Christ. But I would love for you to be comforted. I would love for you to be knit together. I would love for you to appreciate all the riches of the fullness and assurance of understanding, to the acknowledgement of the mystery of God and of the Father and of Jesus Christ. I simply believe he's saying, I think you would understand these things better if I could come and see you. But unfortunately, I can't because what? Because I'm in prison. Because I'm in prison. This is the only means by which I have to communicate with. Paul's almost acknowledging to them. I get it, he says. I understand this is hard to just get a letter in the mail, so to speak. I realize it's difficult to read the words that have been penned and try to extract the knowledge and the understanding that I'm leaning you towards. You know, sometimes, if you ever read a section of a letter that Paul or others write for that matter, and in your mind you might say, well, there seems to be redundancy. You know, he says something and then maybe a verse or two later he kind of says the same thing, maybe just says it a little different, and then maybe even later in the same, and there's redundancy even within the same letter. I believe that's Paul recognizing how difficult it is to communicate via writing. And so as to help them grasp the concepts in greater ways, there's a redundancy at times in the manner in which he expresses things. He knows it's difficult. And you don't necessarily have those same challenges if you can be face to face with folks. You can move more swiftly. You can express things in a manner that's more quickly understood when you're face to face with somebody.
Coming face to face, he would confirm what he's written.
Yeah, and that's another aspect. He would have the ability, if he could get to them personally, to either give further explanation or give greater validation to the things that he had sent to them in letter form.
They could ask questions about what
Sure.
they do not understand. That's one of the hard things about writing.
Right.
You don't know whether they understand it or not.
Right. And we know that happens even in personal communication, because how many times did Jesus say something and his disciples later that night come to him and say, what did you mean by that? What was it? So even in face-to-face moments, it can be a challenge, let alone when you're trying to extract it off the page. And so I think Paul's just simply acknowledging that. He says, this knowledge that he's imparting, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I'm leading you there, Paul says. The wisdom and knowledge that comes from Christ. And this I say, lest any man should beguile you with enticing words. Have you ever been persuaded by somebody who's pretty convincing? Have you ever initially said no to a Kirby vacuum salesman? But he was pretty good at it? And by the time you gave him enough, 5 or 10 minutes of your time, and you saw your carpet and it never looked that good before. And all of a sudden you're become persuaded by something that maybe even initially you thought you'd never be convinced of that. I was willing one time to let I think it was Kirby Vacuums, a fella come and when we lived here in town the first time, back in the 90s, right after Deborah and I were married. And we did that simply because somebody called us and said, hey, can I send this fella to you? If you do, I'm going to buy one. He said, and if I send him to you and let him give his speech to you, then I'll save $100. So will you for me, how could how can you say no, well, something you could, but but here's the point. I'm just trying to draw a picture for you for a minute. We've encountered people who, even with something that we don't necessarily want, but because they have an ability to string enticing words together, we almost become convinced, well, maybe I do need that $2,000 vacuum cleaner. Folks do that spiritually too. The religious world is filled with some really, really good communicators who have tremendous ability to be persuasive and entice folks to think in a certain direction. And so Paul's warning them, listen, I'm challenging you to stay grounded in the message of Jesus. I'm challenging you to stay steadfast in the gospel. I'm challenging you to recognize that all authority is found in Jesus Christ. And I'm doing all this so that when that fella comes and he begins to say something contrary to that gospel, when he begins to teach or share with you something that you can't find in the message of Jesus, but he's really good at persuading you otherwise, you'll be able to say, I'm going to stick with what Jesus has shared. I'm going to stay with what I can validate and establish within the message of the gospel. But I don't think we give enough credit sometimes to how even Satan can present himself as an angel of light. We don't give credit enough sometimes to how easily we can be beguiled, because we like to think that we're above that, right? We like to think we could not be tricked or enticed or lured away, that we're too wise, we've got our wits about us too much. But it's not true. All of us have means by which that folks can advantage and lure and entice us. And so we've got to be ready for when those moments come.
We've got to also remember these people didn't have the written word
Yeah.
back today. And they're hearing the mystery of God for the first time.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, Jim, that makes their challenge even harder. Because they're not they have to be able, from recall, be able to deal with the pressures and difficulties that come from time to time, and the allurements and the enticements. Now, they may be able to say, hey, who's got the copy of Paul's letter? And maybe they could run to that guy and say, what did he say about this or what? So they would have limited access. But they weren't like us walking around with Bibles on their phones in their pocket. Right? They had a lesser ability to be able to access the source. And so it was going to be an even greater challenge to them to make sure they were prepared to handle these moments. Yes, go ahead.
Did they have elders established here yet, or that would oversee to help keep them on track, or?
I'm trying to think. I'll have to look up with Colossae. I'm trying to think. I'm not thinking of anything off the top of my head that would tell me one way or the other. I just went back to the beginning of the letter just to make sure I wasn't missing something simple at the beginning that had some greeting or something to the elders. And I'm trying to think of various moments in the book of Acts, whether there was any reference.
If he'd never been there and it's just preaching to someone else.
Yeah, it may or may not have been. Timothy could be, that's part of his work when he was sent out in different locations. I'll have to look it up. I'll have to look and see for sure. But that the presence of or absence of would have a bearing on the church as a whole and their ability to handle those things. And it's quite possible in their infancy here that they may not yet. But I'll have to look at that a little bit and see. So Paul says, for though I be absent in the flesh, yet I am with you in the Spirit, joying and beholding your order and the steadfastness of your faith in Christ. That phrase may imply to me in some ways that they've got some things established in order. But again, I'll have to look in more detail. But Paul commends them. I'm absent from you, but he appreciates the good things that are happening there. And he appreciates the fact that there seems to be a sense of order among the church at Colossae, and there's a steadfastness about them concerning their faith in Christ and their receptiveness to Jesus. As you have therefore received Christ Jesus the Lord, do what? Verse 6. So walk in Him, right? You need to. There's a time now to start walking and behaving and allowing the direction of our lives to be molded and shaped by the teachings. It's one thing to know what Paul shares about the gospel. It's another thing to understand it. It's another thing to gain the wisdom by it. And it's a whole other thing to start walking and living in it. And that's the way they're going to be able to avoid the enticing allurements. That's the way they're going to be able to face those challenges if they're living it, not just what they know about it. And we'll talk more about that, Lord willing, then Wednesday night. Yeah.